Journalist David Zweig is the latest to participate in the Twitter files. Last week, he published how Twitter rigged the COVID debate by censoring information that was true but inconvenient to U.S. government policy, by discrediting doctors and other experts who disagreed, and by suppressing ordinary users, including some who are sharing the CDC's own data. Here to break down what he found out, journalist David Zweig. Wonderful to have you with us, David.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so what were the big headlines from your perusal of the Twitter files? What did you see that really caught your attention?
I think there were a few key things. The first one is that there certainly was evidence of direct pressure from the White House in both the Trump administration, but much more so from the Biden administration on Twitter to get them to moderate specific content. So the first thing is government involvement or sort of government pressure. And then the larger part of my reporting that I found fascinating and that I was curious about, that really prompted me to want to go to San Francisco, was to get a little bit better understanding of what goes on sort of behind the scenes at Twitter. These social media platforms that hundreds of millions of us use, it's very, very opaque about how the algorithms work and what the process is. So I really wanted to uncover a little bit the process by which, they decide which things get flagged as misleading and which things don't.
So let's talk about that process a little bit. You wrote that part of the issue is that so much of the content moderation was being done by bots who were insufficiently nuanced to actually capture what even the intention was by the people at Twitter. And at other points, you talk about content moderation decisions that were made kind of contrary to Twitter's own policy. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I think a lot of us hear the word algorithm or bots. It's not really entirely clear what that means. I spent a long time talking with an engineer at Twitter, as well as another executive, trying to just get a little bit better understanding of what that stuff means. And basically, when we talk about bots, they essentially train the employees will train the software, the system, through machine learning and through AI. They feed it, a handful of tweets or key terms or other things like that. And then the more the sort of bots crawl across the network, the more they train themselves about what to look for. And then periodically over time, humans will actually feeding it more inputs to help sort of refine what the bots are looking for. So that's kind of the very basic sketch about how these bots work. But we have to understand it always comes back to the humans who are actually deciding what the inputs are for the bots to look for.
When we were talking about the Twitter files in the context of the FBI and the Hunter Biden laptop and election stuff, what we saw, I think at first at least, was a lot of resistance on Twitter's part to be overly compliant with the government, and then that kind of resistance being eroded gradually when the government employees keep coming back to them over and over again and really, not threatening, using very careful language, but pushing them more and more toward a compliance mindset. Did you see a similar thing happening here from the White House and the CDC perspective with respect to COVID?
Well, what we do know is from an internal email that I found from an executive at Twitter, Lauren Culbertson, where she characterized the multiple meetings from the Biden White House, and she characterized the tone of the White House staff members being, quote, very angry with Twitter, that they were not being more compliant with the White House's, wishes or demands, as it were, that they really, really wanted them to be much more aggressive with deplatforming whoever they deemed were, quote, anti-vaxxers or information that they deemed to be insufficiently in accordance with the sort of White House and CDC guidelines.
Yeah, I want to be specific about the kind of tweets that we're talking about being censored here. You mentioned one in particular by Martin Kuldroff, who tweeted out that basically thinking that everyone must be vaccinated is scientifically flawed thinking, as is the thinking that nobody should be vaccinated. Vaccines are more important for older, high-risk people and their caretakers. Those with natural prior infection do not need it, nor children. And this is something that is obviously much more discussed today as we have learned more, perhaps people already knew more, about the failures of the vaccines to prevent transmission the way that we thought they might before. So the argument in the earlier days was, even though we do know that kids are relatively at low risk, that older people and people who are immunocompromised and have other comorbidities are at higher risk, they could still pass it along to people with higher risk, and therefore everybody should get vaccinated regardless of their own personal risk. I wonder what you make, having looked through the decision-making kind of behind the door. Do you have a feeling that those kinds of statements were suppressed because they believed them sincerely to be false, or because there was this broader project of just wanting to get as many people vaccinated as possible so that the economy could keep going, so that stores could reopen? Because you also mentioned earlier in your thread that there was this censoring of information that might lead to panic buying. And that reminds me of the run on the masks, the concern that there would be a run on a mask, and people lying, the early days where they were lying to the public about the efficacy of masks, in part because they wanted to preserve them for medical professionals.
Yeah, good questions. It's hard to know precisely the motivations, of course, of the individual employees. All we do know is the sort of broader policies that were in place. And there were many more examples that I had that I didn't include in my Twitter thread or in my larger piece that I wrote for the Free Press, because, there's only so many examples to give. But what I tried to show through a series of examples, like the Koldorf tweet that you mentioned, is that we had incidences where there were highly credentialed professionals like Martin Koldorf, a Harvard professor, and others, or even regular users who were either just simply giving their opinion, which is valid to give someone's opinion. It wasn't false. It was merely Dr. Koldorf's opinion, or they were actually quoting real data from peer-reviewed journals, or even data from the CDC itself. And these tweets were nevertheless being suppressed in one way or another. Either they were labeled as misleading, at times the tweets or the accounts themselves were suspended because of this material. So that's kind of the broader thing, that rather than conjecturing too much about the sort of motives or the why, other than seeing evidence of the White House pressure, what we do know is to actually look at the evidence we have before us. And we can see over and over again that tweets that were really of genuine substantive material, like, as I said, something from a peer-reviewed journal, that nevertheless were flagged by the bots and then ultimately by humans at Twitter itself. And I think that's the kind of broader pattern that we saw. And, it obviously for any citizen, this raises a lot of questions about, how social media platforms should function, and, content moderation, and where do they draw the line? I don't know the answers to those questions, but I wanted to at least present information for people to see.
And you point out, Trump had tweeted something about, say, don't be afraid of COVID, don't let it dominate your life. That was on October 5th. 2020, and you say that prompted a lot of internal discussion about whether that was misleading information. And then actually Jim Baker, who's this former FBI figure at Twitter, we've criticized previously and was fired by Elon Musk. But then when Biden had a don't be afraid of COVID tweet, so he flagged that then for Yoel Roth and was like, well, are we going to have a whole debate over this one then? Which I think really highlights the degree to which this policy became absurd, when you're sort of like trying to moderate people's sort of optimistic feelings, right?
Yeah, it was that was one of the, I combed through thousands of emails internally, and this was one of the ones that just, I think I described it as surreal, that you had a Trump tweet where he said, like, hey, everybody, like, don't be afraid of COVID. I think he had just gotten out of the hospital or something. And Jim Baker, the deputy, I believe his title was deputy counsel, that's sort of one of the lead attorney at Twitter, is part of this broader, big internal discussion about whether the tweet should be taken down or labeled misleading, was saying, hey, doesn't this violate our policy? And Yoel Roth had to respond to him, look, sorry, but optimism is not misinformation. So it was just, that's when you realize things have gone completely off the rails, when, high-level executives in internal discussions in a very, sincere way are questioning whether a statement of optimism is considered misinformation. That's a problem.
David, I want to ask you about some of the pushback that you've gotten. People have pointed to some of your ideological priors, saying that you're supportive of the Great Barrington Declaration or being generally kind of ideologically aligned with some of the tweets that have been censored, biases your review of the documents and internal files. And I wonder what you make of that criticism, and if you think that some of the reception of the reporting coming out of the Twitter files would be better and better perceived among people who don't share those ideological priors if there was some diversity in the folks who've been chosen to look through these files. So if someone like both yourself and someone who has been more, let's say, aligned with the CDC recommendations or the censorship choices that have been made, were also being confronted with doing the same process alongside you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say, first off, every journalist, every human has their own biases and their own lens through which they see the world and any, long list of topics. So the notion that people who were, quote, contrarian had more of a bias or were more affected by their lens through which they see the world than other people is silly. The journalists at, all sorts of legacy and mainstream media outlets had their own bias that pushed things. So that's one thing to set aside. I don't think there's one sort of perfect, objective journalist or lens through which anything can be seen. But secondarily, what's interesting is in one of the tweets that I showed was a response to a user who had tweeted out a screenshot of CDC data itself, and the tweet got flagged as, quote, misinformation. It was about this person named Kelly. She was showing that, contrary to what someone else has said, that COVID has never been the leading cause of death for children. And when she got into an exchange with an employee at Twitter, the person ultimately said to her, look, it's our policy to specifically look and go after content that may possibly lead to increased transmission or something of that nature. So I think that's a really important window into the sort of broader mindset and approach of Twitter, which I think gets to your question, which is that, and lots and lots of people, me among them, noticed this anecdotally for years, that the most outlandish claims, people from this person named Eric Feigl-Ding, just these most hyperbolic, fear-mongering craziness were never flagged. But yet time and time again, you'd see something, even if it's quoting CDC data itself, those were labeled as misleading. So we saw this anecdotally, but this exchange, this correspondence that this person had with the Twitter staff member really helped illuminate why we had seen this, which is that they always seemed to side with more aggressive moderation approach against anything that would seem to go against the CDC's guidelines and approach, or anything that would sort of lean toward being less aggressive with mitigations. And that sort of was the official policy. So I appreciate if people thought that, I'm picking and choosing things, but the things that I chose aligned with, they exemplified what was the official policy at Twitter.
Yeah, there's no reason to necessarily doubt that, except for that the lack of transparency, these documents not being made widely available is of course going to lead people to bring skepticism to them. And, it does seem to be the case that if you want a broader audience to take this kind of reporting seriously, that it wouldn't necessarily hurt to have different ideological sets of eyes on it, because as you point out, everybody has their biases, and the only way it seems to me to get around that is to have the kind of ideological diversity that we have here on this panel. But we appreciate you joining us today, David.
Thanks for having me.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.